The first thing she noticed was the paper, crumpled, sticky with something dark she didn't dare look at, pressed under the heavy paw of Rusty, her aunt's old shepherd. Her small hands trembled as she peeled it free. The jagged handwriting scrawled across the page, making her chest tighten. "He's beating Mama." Outside, the wind rattled the broken shutters, a hollow moan that seemed to echo the words on the page. She wanted to scream, to call out, but her voice got stuck somewhere between fear and disbelief. The sunlight that should have warmed the kitchen only made the shadows stretch longer, slithering along the walls like silent predators. Rusty nudged her shoulder, whining softly, a reminder that someone, somehow, was listening. Somewhere beyond the screen door, the world was moving on, unaware of the terror trapped inside these four walls. And here she was, 9 years old, clutching a note that could destroy everything she had ever known about home. Her stomach churned, her heartbeat thundering in her ears, as if it were trying to warn her that one wrong step could shatter her life completely. She took a deep breath, feeling the grit of dust under her nails, the faint metallic taste of fear on her tongue, and knew she had to act. Somehow, she had to get help before it was too late. The note wasn't meant to be found. It had been shoved beneath the kitchen door, crumpled and damp from some careless spill, and pressed into the floorboard by Rusty's heavy paw. When she saw it, the first thing she felt wasn't fear. It was disbelief. 9 years old, small enough to still believe the world made sense, she stared at the jagged handwriting, each letter sharp and urgent. "He's beating Mama." Her hands shook, though she tried to grip the paper with a sense of control. The smell of old wood and burnt toast hung in the air, and the faint metallic tang of dust from the cracked windows made her nose wrinkle. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the broken shutters with a hollow groan that felt like it was coming from inside the house itself. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to the neighbor's house, wanted to tell someone, anyone, but a cold weight sank into her chest. Fear wrapped around her ribs like iron bands, and she couldn't breathe past it. Her eyes darted to the door, imagining every shadow moving, every sound amplified, the drip of water from the leaky faucet, the creak of floorboards underfoot, even the subtle shuffle of Rusty's paws against the linoleum. He nudged her shoulder gently, whine low and soft, a reminder that she was not alone. And yet it was as if the house itself was holding its breath with her, waiting for her to decide. Memories of yesterday came unbidden, the echoes of yelling muffled through walls, the slam of doors, her mother's voice quivering, apologetic, fearful. She had always tried to make it feel like nothing had happened, wrapping bruises in long sleeves and forcing smiles at the dinner table. But the note erased every pretense. Every lie she had told herself about home being safe dissolved in that moment, leaving only a raw, aching truth she could not deny. She felt small in the center of the kitchen, the sunlight coming through the gaps in the shutters creating long, jagged stripes across the floor, cutting her into pieces she didn't recognize. Rusty pawed at the note again, whining, impatient, as if urging her to do something. She crouched, folding herself around the paper, tracing the letters with trembling fingertips. How could she be the one to save her mother? She was just a child, a little girl with scraped knees, knotted hair, and a heart too big for her age. And yet every instinct inside her screamed that she had to act. She took a shaky breath, feeling the grit of dust under her nails, the faint taste of iron on her tongue. She imagined herself speaking into the empty air, calling for help, but her voice caught, strangled by terror and disbelief. She moved to the window, pulling back the frayed curtain. The world outside was gray and restless, clouds chasing each other across a sky that promised rain. The trees bent and creaked in the wind, their branches scratching at the siding of the house like fingernails. Somewhere, distant but sharp, a car door slammed, and the sound made her flinch. Everything seemed ordinary, and yet she knew ordinary had been lying to her all this time. Home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cave. She could almost hear the walls whispering secrets, the house remembering every argument, every slammed door, every quiet cry she had heard but never understood. The dog nudged her again, insistent, and she felt a flicker of courage rise in her chest. Rusty had always been her protector, her silent companion through scraped knees and stormy nights. Now he seemed to understand the gravity of what she held, the fragile, burning truth pressed in her little fist. She took another breath, this one steadier, and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We have to do something." The words were small, almost ridiculous against the enormity of it all. but they were the first movement in a chain of decisions that could save her mother. Her mind raced. The neighbors were far. The adults she trusted seemed too busy to notice anything, too wrapped up in their own lives to see the shadows creeping across her own home. But Rusty, loyal and steady, was beside her, and suddenly the impossible felt like it could bend. She pictured the note reaching someone who could help, someone who would understand the urgency in those jagged letters. Somewhere beyond the wind and broken windows, someone had to act. And if not her, then who? She folded the note carefully, pressing it against her chest, feeling the texture of the paper and the weight of the words like a stone. Each second stretched long, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Outside, a crow cawed, sharp and urgent, and she imagined the sound carrying her message to the world. Rusty's tail thumped against the floor, a heartbeat in the silence, steady and unjudging. He seemed to say, "We can do this together." The kitchen felt smaller now, the shadows longer, but the decision had taken root. She would not let fear paralyze her. She would not let her mother suffer alone. Her small frame straightened, and though her legs wobbled and her stomach twisted with panic, she stepped toward the door. Every step was measured, a careful negotiation with the terror that wrapped her in trembling bands. The wind howled louder, rattling the shutters like a warning, but she imagined it as a drumbeat leading her forward. She thought of the note again, the desperate scrawl, and let herself feel the weight of what she held. It was not just a message, it was a lifeline, a call to action, a bridge between helplessness and hope. She clenched it tightly, Rusty's head brushing against her hip, and took another step. The light through the door was pale and unforgiving, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the hallway like tiny ghosts. She could almost hear her mother moving somewhere beyond the rooms, the muffled sounds of someone trying to hide, to pretend, to survive. And then she made her first real decision. She would get help. She would take this note to someone who could save her mother. Her hands, once trembling, felt steadier now, each pulse of fear sharpening her focus rather than breaking it. Rusty barked softly, as if in agreement, and together they moved through the house, past the cracked tiles and leaning counters, past the shadows that had seemed so threatening just moments before. The note was clutched like a talisman, the only thing standing between despair and action. As she reached the front door, the wind gusted violently, nearly knocking her off balance, scattering a few fallen leaves across the porch. The sky overhead was a swirl of gray and silver, the clouds moving fast, charged with the promise of storm. She felt her pulse in her throat, in her temples, and for the first time, she allowed herself a single thought. "I can do this. I have to." Rusty pressed closer, his warmth a small comfort in the freezing reality of what she was about to do. The note had to reach someone. Someone would understand. Someone would help. And so, with a trembling hand on the doorknob, heart hammering like the storm outside, she opened the door. The wind tore at her hair and chilled her skin, but she stepped out small and fragile and determined, carrying a truth too heavy for her age. Behind her, the house seemed to exhale, the shadows receding just slightly, the silence stretching long and taut. She didn't look back. Rusty padded at her side, alert, protective, and together they walked into the gray morning, a little girl with a note that could change everything, and a dog who would not let her face it alone. The street felt impossibly wide and cold. The gray morning had deepened into a bruised, heavy sky, and the wind tugged at her thin jacket as if testing her resolve. Rusty stayed close, ears pricked, tail low but firm, a living anchor beneath her trembling frame. Each step toward the neighbor's house felt like walking across a tightrope, strung above a chasm of fear. She clutched the note to her chest, its edges soft and worn from gripping, and every second her mind replayed her mother's muffled cries, her small fingers brushing against bruised skin she wasn't supposed to see. She was a child, yet the enormity of responsibility pressed on her like water on lungs, threatening to pull her under. She passed the cracked lamppost by the corner, the faint hum of electricity buzzing through it making her flint. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, a deceptive calm that mocked the chaos inside her home. She imagined her mother behind locked doors, trying to seem fine, trying to breathe normally, trying to make the world think nothing was wrong. And in that moment, a surge of silent anger coursed through her, angry not just at the man who had hurt her mother, but at the universe for leaving her so small, so powerless until now. Rusty stopped abruptly, sniffing at the base of a chain-link fence. His body was taut, a low growl resonating from his chest. She followed his gaze and caught sight of a small cat darting through a yard. a sudden reminder that life went on, indifferent to pain. But she shook the thought away. There was no room for distraction. Not today. Today she had a mission, and she could feel the weight of it in the ache of her knees and the thrum of her heart. The neighbor's door loomed ahead, pale blue paint peeling at the edges, wind chimes rattling faintly in the draft. Her fingers itched to knock, but her courage faltered. What if no one believed her? What if her trembling voice made everything seem imagined? She inhaled deeply, tasting the chill of winter in her lungs, the faint tang of wet leaves underfoot. Rusty nudged her hand with his cold nose, as if reminding her that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. She squared her shoulders and lifted her hand, letting it fall onto the weathered door with a solid knock. The sound echoed hollowly down the empty street, and she waited, pulse hammering, stomach knotting, cheeks hot with fear and determination. The door opened, a cautious face peering out, a neighbor she had waved to 100 times but never really known. Recognition flickered in his eyes, quickly replaced by concern. "Hey, kid, what's wrong?" His voice was low, gentle, but urgent. She swallowed, trying to form words that seemed too heavy for her small mouth. She pressed the note into his hand, fingers shaking so violently he had to steady them. "Mama, he's hurting her," she whispered, her voice cracked like thin ice underfoot. "You have to help." The man read the note, eyes widening with a slow, horrifying comprehension. Rusty stayed alert at her side, growling softly, sensing the gravity of the moment. She felt a strange mixture of relief and continued fear, the acknowledgement of danger, terrifying in its own right, yet validating the truth she had carried alone. The neighbor didn't hesitate. "Stay here with me," he said, voice firm, and within moments he was on his phone, calling numbers she barely understood, summoning voices that sounded official, sharp, determined. Rusty pressed against her side, warm and steady as the minutes stretched into eternity. The girl's small hands clutched his fur, grounding herself in the only solid thing she could trust. The wind picked up, rattling the doorframe, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and pine, a reminder that the outside world existed, that life moved forward even when it seemed impossible. She watched the neighbor's lips move in hurried conversation, the occasional sharp nod, the subtle hand gestures she didn't understand, and realized the world was responding to her plea. Somehow, she had made it real. The dog suddenly stiffened, ears forward, tail low but alert. From the street she saw the flashing of lights, red and blue, bouncing off wet pavements and curving roofs. The sound of sirens rolled toward her, distant but rising, a wave of relief and tension that left her breathless. It was real. People were coming. People who could stop the nightmare, people who could bring safety. She let herself breathe shallow at first, the tightness in her chest loosening in tiny increments. Rusty leaned into her, and she hugged him, pressing her face into his coarse fur, letting the warmth steady her trembling. Voices approached, calm but urgent, commanding yet compassionate. The girls stayed behind the neighbor's shoulder, watching as uniformed figures moved with precision, their presence immediately changing the tone of the street. Each footstep, each shouted instruction, each careful glance heightened the tension and layered relief over her fear. She felt invisible and essential all at once, a strange duality that made her stomach flutter. Her mother's life, once fragile and hidden in shadows, was suddenly in the hands of people who could act decisively, and she, a small child with a note and a loyal dog, had set the chain in motion. Rusty whimpered softly, sensing her nervous energy. She stroked his head, whispering, "It's okay, we did it." Her voice, tiny and shaky, carried hope she hadn't felt before. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, damp earth, and asphalt into her lungs. Every sense felt heightened, the smell, the sounds, the energy around her vibrating with urgency. She imagined her mother inside, frightened, unaware that rescue had already begun, unaware that help was coming, and a bittersweet ache tore through her chest. She wished she could tell her mother not to be afraid, not to hide, but new words alone could not bridge the terror she had endured. The neighbor's eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw understanding, acknowledgement, and something like awe. A small smile brushed her lips, fleeting and delicate, as she realized the courage she had summoned silently had been enough. She had been brave without knowing how. She had acted without promise of safety, without guarantee that anyone would believe her. And now, amidst sirens and uniforms, she felt the first fragile tendrils of relief, coiling carefully around the fear still gripping her ribs. A uniformed officer crouched to her level, voice gentle but firm. "You did the right thing, kid. You're safe now." The words were heavy with sincerity, and she nodded, unable to speak, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Rusty pressed closer, nose brushing her cheek, and she let herself shiver with exhaustion, relief, and the lingering edge of fear. The note in her hand felt lighter now, no longer a burden she carried alone, but a bridge that had brought help, a lifeline she had thrown into the storm. She turned her gaze to the street, watching officers move with precision, forming a quiet but unyielding barrier around her home. The wind had died slightly, leaving a soft drizzle that coated her hair and jacket, a cleansing, tentative baptism for the day's terror. She felt the tension in her body ebb in tiny increments, each exhale a small release of the fear she had carried alone for too long. Rusty's presence remained steady, a reminder that some things at least endured. In that moment, she realized that courage didn't roar. It whispered, quiet and persistent, carried by small hands and loyal hearts. She had found hers in silence and action, in the trust she placed in her dog, in the hope that someone, somewhere, would listen. The neighbor's phone call had summoned more than help. It had validated her truth, elevated it into action, made her feel seen in a way that the house, with all its shadows and secrets, never could. As she watched the first officer step inside her home and Rusty pressed his warm head against her side, she understood something vital. She had been small, fragile, and scared, and yet she had made the first move in a chain of events that would save a life. The storm outside had not been vanquished, but inside her, a fragile flame of courage had ignited, and in the silence that followed, punctuated only by distant sirens and Rusty's low whine, she felt the faintest possibility of hope threading through the fear, weaving itself carefully into the tapestry of her small, resilient heart. The street had changed entirely. The gray drizzle had turned streets into slick mirrors, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights, bouncing against the wet asphalt in fractured patterns. The air vibrated with urgency, the sharp, commanding voices of officers cutting through the steady hum of rain. Her small hands gripped Rusty's fur tightly as they stepped closer, the dog alert, muscles coiled like springs ready to protect her. Every sense was alive, the metallic scent of wet concrete and rubber, the hiss of tires over puddles, the low rumble of engines mingling with distant thunder. She felt simultaneously invisible and exposed, a witness to a world she had never known existed, one that moved with precision and purpose far beyond her 9-year-old understanding. She watched the officers position themselves, faces taut with focus, hands gripping equipment that gleamed under the rain and flashing lights. One crouched and gestured for the others, and in that instant, the girl realized the enormity of the situation. This was not just a phone call, not just a neighbor's concern. This was a storm that had arrived, formidable, organized, unstoppable, and she was at the very edge of it. Her heartbeat surged in her chest, and the note still pressed to her chest felt like a bridge she had thrown into this chaos, a fragile lifeline that had reached the right hands. Rusty's growl was low and steady, a vibration through her side. She pressed against him instinctively, letting the dog's warmth and presence ground her. She imagined her mother somewhere inside, behind closed doors, the muffled sound of breath, the subtle creak of movement betraying fear. The girl's stomach churned, a knot of worry and helplessness, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, to count the seconds as though each inhale was a lifeline. The lead officer approached her, voice calm but commanding. "Stay close to your dog. Don't move, everything's gonna be okay." His eyes were steady, not patronizing, and something in that gaze made her small chest unclench just slightly. She nodded, swallowing a lump in her throat, and let Rusty lead her to the curb, just far enough to be safe, close enough to feel the surge of action unfolding around her home. The officers moved like shadows trained by purpose, silently, efficiently, communicating with hand signals and short-clipped words. It was mesmerizing, terrifying, and awe-inspiring all at once. From where she stood, she could see them approaching the house, a unit of precision, every step calculated. Her fingers itched to run inside, to tell her mother that help was here, but she knew she could not. She could only watch, small and powerless, as strangers carried the weight of her family's safety. The rain ran in rivulets down her cheeks, indistinguishable from tears, and she barely noticed, lost in the surreal clarity of the moment. Suddenly, a shout cracked through the air, sharp and commanding. A door that had always seemed impenetrable now became the epicenter of tension. She imagined her mother behind it, heart racing, fists clenched, trying to make sense of the chaos erupting beyond her walls. Every sound, the slam of a boot against a door, the hiss of a locked mechanism disengaging, the low murmur of officers moving in unison, was magnified, slicing through the drizzle and settling into the marrow of her bones. She pressed Rusty closer, inhaling his scent, trying to tether herself to something familiar as the storm of authority enveloped her home. She glimpsed the dog who had carried the note, running ahead, small and frantic, a flash of brown fur weaving through the rain. Rusty had always been her protector, and now he seemed almost ceremonial in his role, part of the force moving with precision, bridging the gap between danger and safety. The girl's chest ached with simultaneous pride and fear. Every second was a test of patience, endurance, and trust. The officers had their rhythm. She had only the hope that her mother would be okay. Time became fractured, moments stretching endlessly. Each one waited with anticipation. A loud bang, too loud, too sudden, made her flinch. Rusty barked sharply, tension rippling through his body. The girl's knees trembled beneath her, and she pressed her face to his fur, letting him absorb some of her terror. She imagined her mother flinching at the same sound, heart hammering, trapped in fear and uncertainty. And in that shared invisible terror, she felt a strange connection, a thread of life tying them together, a reminder that she was not alone, that her mother's safety was within reach. Then came the first glimpse of movement inside. The door opened, and a figure emerged, shoulders slumped, but alive. Relief surged so violently she almost couldn't breathe, but it was quickly tempered by fear. Fear that it might be a trap, that danger wasn't yet past. She watched as the officers converged, voices steady, hands ready to act, and realized that courage existed in many forms, inside her mother's trembling body, in Rusty's steady vigilance, in the officer's unwavering precision, and in her own quiet decision to act in the first place. The girl felt tears slip freely now, rain mingling with them, washing away some of the rawness that had defined the morning. She had been the spark, the note, her small body Rusty's insistence, but the blaze of action had been carried forward by others. It was humbling, terrifying, and oddly beautiful to witness. She had never understood how layered bravery could be, how a single act could ripple outward, affecting lives in ways she could never fully grasp. An officer crouched beside her, voice soft but commanding. "You're safe now. You did the right thing." She nodded, unable to speak, pressed into Rusty, who had never left her side. The world around her was still chaotic, rain pattering, sirens wailing, voices echoing, but in that small island of calm, she understood something profound. Courage could exist quietly, unseen in the decision to act when everything was terrifying. She had acted, and now others carried that courage forward into the storm. She watched the officers guide her mother from the house, the woman's face streaked with tears, eyes wide with disbelief. And for the first time in hours, the girl allowed herself to imagine safety. Rusty nudged her, and she realized she was trembling, not just from fear, but from relief, exhaustion, and the first faint glimmer of hope. The rain had not stopped, but the storm inside her felt a little less suffocating. For the first time, she let herself breathe fully, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of the moment. She had been small, terrified, and alone, and yet she had moved. The note in her hand, the loyalty of her dog, and the courage she hadn't known she possessed had set events into motion that would save her mother. And as the officers continued their work, securing the house, checking for dangers she could not see, she realized that bravery came in layers. The silent courage of action, the visible courage of protection, and the quiet resilience of surviving fear and hope together. Rusty pressed close again, warm and steady, and she rested her head against him, letting the dog's heartbeat sync with hers. The rain fell heavier now, the wind swirling around them, but the world no longer seemed entirely hostile. Somewhere beyond the flashing lights and shouting voices, life was beginning to stitch itself back together, and she, a little girl with trembling hands, a loyal dog, and a note that could change everything, had stepped into the storm and begun the process of turning terror into safety. The front door groaned under the weight of authority, bending slightly as officers pushed with steady, synchronized force. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood, faint smoke, and something acrid that made the girl's stomach twist. Rusty's fur bristled beneath her hand, low growls vibrating through his chest, as if he could sense the tension that even the uniforms could not completely erase. The girl's pulse raced in her ears. a deafening rhythm that competed with the shouted commands of the SWAT team. She felt small and distant, as though watching a storm unfold from behind a thin pane of glass, yet each moment inside the house was mirrored in her own tightening chest. Her mother appeared first, leaning against the wall, hair damp from sweat, face pale with exhaustion and fear. The sight struck the girl like a physical blow. She had imagined every possible outcome, most of them worse than reality, but none prepared her for the raw, fragile vulnerability before her. Her mother's eyes met hers, wide and uncomprehending at first, and the girl could see the flash of terror still lodged in them. And then recognition, the understanding that she, the small child clutching a crumpled note, had brought salvation to their doorstep. The man responsible, looming intense, moved like a shadow, a mix of fear and anger in every flick of his wrist. Officers called commands, clear and firm, cutting through the thick air, but the tension held, taut as a wire. Rusty barked sharply, breaking the fragile silence, and the girl's heart leapt. Her dog, steady and brave, was still her anchor. She pressed herself against the wall, hands gripping his fur, feeling every vibration of his body as though absorbing courage through him. The room seemed smaller, walls closing in, each breath thick with anticipation and dread. Suddenly, movement, quick, sharp, and the man lunged. One officer reacted instantly, another covering, voices overlapping in calm, precise commands that carved a path through chaos. The girl froze, nails digging into Rusty's coarse fur, stomach twisting with fear. She could hear the slap of boots against linoleum, the low grunts of effort, the sudden sharp cry that shattered the fragile tension. Rusty growled louder, head low, tail rigid, and the girl felt herself trembling, caught between terror and relief, unable to look away even as every instinct screamed to hide. A loud thud, the metallic clatter of handcuffs, and then silence. The officers stood, bodies coiled but controlled, the threat neutralized with efficiency that left no room for hesitation. The girl's knees weakened, and she sank to the floor beside Rusty, hugging him tightly, letting her tears fall freely at last. Her mother approached, hands trembling as they reached for her, eyes still wide with disbelief and relief. The girl could feel the weight of fear lifting inch by inch, replaced by a raw, fragile sense of victory. The storm had passed, but the echo of tension lingered, vibrating in the air like residual electricity. Rusty nuzzled her cheek, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a grounding pulse of loyalty and protection that reminded her she was not alone. Her mother's hands pressed against hers, shaking, grounding, and for a moment, the chaos of the past hours crystallized into a single powerful truth. Courage existed in the smallest actions, in notes clutched by trembling fingers, in the quiet insistence of a dog refusing to leave her side. She had been a conduit for hope, a bridge between terror and rescue, and now, in the aftermath, she could finally feel the weight of what she had done. The officers began to move through the house, checking corners, securing doors, their presence both reassuring and surreal. The girl and her mother were guided to a small room, away from immediate danger, where she could finally exhale. Rain drummed against the windows, a persistent rhythm that mirrored her still throbbing pulse. Every sense felt acute. The smell of wet earth and damp wood, the low hum of officers communicating outside the room, the occasional shuffle of boots on wet linoleum, all of it grounding her in the reality of survival, of safety, of a nightmare that ended not with despair, but with action and courage. Her mother knelt beside her, voice soft and quivering. You saved us." The words were simple, but they carried a weight the girl could feel deep in her chest. She shook her head, pressed into Rusty, who had settled beside her like a steadfast guardian, and whispered, "I just did what I had to." Her voice was tiny, almost lost beneath the low rumble of the rain and distant sirens, but it held a fragile strength. She realized then that bravery was not loud or heroic in the traditional sense. It was persistent, quiet, and often invisible until the consequences became visible in relief and safety. The room smelled faintly of coffee and burnt toast, remnants of a morning that had begun in fear and confusion. Rusty rested his head in her lap, eyes soft and vigilant, and she stroked his fur, feeling the reassuring texture beneath her fingers. Outside, officers were still moving with precision, voices calling, boots echoing, a reminder that the world had shifted, danger had been contained, but life was still moving, still real, still fragile. She allowed herself a slow, shuddering breath, letting the tension unwind, letting relief and exhaustion mingle in her chest until she could feel them separately. She looked at her mother again, face streaked with tears but alive, and something inside her softened. The terror of the morning had left indelible marks, yet it had also revealed the contours of courage, love, and resilience. She understood for the first time that strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. She had acted, a small hand reaching out into a storm she did not fully understand, and that action had set into motion the rescue that saved her family. Rusty sighed, a deep, contented sound, and she leaned into him, letting his warmth seep into her exhausted body. The storm outside had not ended. The rain persisted, the wind tugged at the roof, the sky remained bruised, but inside the house felt lighter. The shadows that had once loomed so large were shrinking, replaced by the soft, trembling light of recovery. She pressed her mother's hand once more, feeling the pulse of life and gratitude, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where fear did not dominate every moment. Outside, the rain began to soften, turning from a harsh downpour into a fine, steady drizzle. The flashing lights of police cars reflected against puddles, shimmering like fractured stars across the wet street. The girl's heart slowed, each beat a quiet echo of courage, action, and hope. Rusty pressed closer, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the sound of his breathing anchor her in the present. She had survived. They had survived. The nightmare had ended not with despair, but with decisive, careful courage. And as she finally looked around the room, at the officers moving with steady precision, at her mother who was trembling but safe, at Rusty who had remained unwavering at her side, she understood something she had not known before. Fear and bravery could coexist. One could tremble and act, one could be small and still wield enormous power. The world was not safe, not entirely, but within this room, with these people, with her dog, and with the note she had carried like a talisman, she found the first fragile, shining strands of hope. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle by dawn, the gray sky slowly lightening to pale blue, and the world outside seemed almost untouched by the chaos of yesterday. She stepped onto the porch with Rusty at her side, fur damp, ears perked, alert but calm. The street smelled of wet earth and pine, faint smoke from distant chimneys curling into the air, and the soft patter of raindrops on leaves created a rhythm she felt in her chest. Everything was quiet now, deceptively calm, yet every detail, the dripping water from the gutters, the scattered leaves, the soft hum of a car engine in the distance, felt amplified, precious, alive. Her mother emerged behind her, tentative steps careful on the wet wood, and the girl felt a flutter in her chest, a mix of relief and fragile pride. They hadn't just survived, they had endured, together, through fear and uncertainty, through helplessness and courage. The bruises on her mother's arms were faintly visible beneath her sleeves, pale reminders of a nightmare now behind them. But the light in her eyes, tentative, grateful, unsteady, spoke of something stronger, resilience. The girl pressed closer to Rusty, who leaned into her, the warmth of his body, a tether to the present, a comfort that had carried her through every step. The officers were gone, their work completed with quiet precision, leaving behind an organized chaos. The faint scent of adrenaline, wet boots on the pavement, papers scattered from a hastily abandoned clipboard. She noticed the subtle traces of their presence, the mud tracks on the floor, the careful placement of tools, the calm efficiency that had transformed terror into safety. Her mind replayed the events, each moment sharper, more vivid in memory than any nightmare could be. The note clutched in her small hands, the wind battering against the windows, Rusty's growl, her mother's trembling relief. Each memory was a thread, weaving together into a tapestry that was painful, terrifying, and yet undeniably beautiful in its testament to survival. They stood together on the porch, the soft drizzle coating their hair and jackets, and the girl realized that everything had changed. The house no longer felt like a trap, though the memories of screams and slammed doors lingered like shadows on the walls. She knew they would not vanish, not entirely, but the fear that had once dominated every moment had loosened its grip, replaced by cautious hope. She looked at her mother, hands trembling slightly as she reached for hers, and the gesture felt like a bridge spanning a canyon of terror and relief. Rusty pressed between them, the warmth of his fur grounding the fragile, luminous moment. The girl's mind wandered to the note, that fragile piece of paper that had started the chain of events. She traced the creases with her finger, feeling the texture, the weight of every desperate word pressed into it. It had been her voice when hers had trembled, her courage when her body had quivered, her hope when every instinct screamed to hide. She realized with a subtle ache in her chest that heroism was not grandiose or loud. It was quiet, persistent, carried in small hands, in loyal companions, in the bravery to act despite fear. Rusty whined softly, and she leaned into him, feeling a deep, grounding pulse of connection that reminded her of the power of loyalty and love. A faint breeze stirred the branches of the trees lining the street, the leaves shaking loose the last remnants of rain. She inhaled deeply, tasting the crisp, wet air, feeling it fill her lungs with something new, possibility, calm, a cautious optimism she had not known she could feel. The streets, still slick and reflective, stretched ahead like a promise, the puddles catching the light of the morning sky, fractured stars reflected in tiny mirrors. She imagined walking through life with Rusty by her side, with her mother beside her, carrying the memory of fear transformed into courage, and she felt a small, unsteady smile tug at her lips. Her mother's hand tightened around hers, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to relax, to let the adrenaline and tension drain from her muscles. Every tremor, every sharp inhale, every ache of fear began to soften, replaced by a quiet warmth. Rusty leaned his head against her ankle, and she scratched behind his ears, the sound of his contented sigh filling the space between them. In that moment, she understood something profound. Safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of those who acted with love, loyalty, and bravery. She had been small, 9 years old, frightened, yet she had been the spark that ignited rescue, the thread that had carried them from despair into light. She glanced back at the house, the windows fogged from the cold and the events of the past hours, and imagined the walls remembering what had happened, the fear, the courage, the decisive action that had reshaped the space. The shadows of yesterday still lingered in corners, but the air now felt lighter, cleaner, carrying a fragile sense of peace. Her mother pulled her close, arms trembling, and whispered words that felt like a blessing. "You saved us." The girl pressed her forehead to her mother's shoulder, letting herself absorb the reality of those words, feeling the tremor of hope, the fragile warmth of triumph mingling with relief. Rusty barked softly, and the girl laughed quietly, a sound that felt foreign and beautiful after the tension that had gripped her body for hours. She realized that life would not suddenly be easy, that fear would occasionally return in echoes, shadows that stretched long in quiet moments. But she also understood that courage had roots deeper than fear, that small actions could ripple into enormous consequences, that loyalty and love could carve paths through storms. Every droplet of rain, every shaft of morning light, every tremor of breath felt infused with possibility. As the drizzle faded, the first hints of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the wet street with golden reflection. She watched Rusty shake himself, water flying in tiny arcs, and the motion felt symbolic, shaking off the remnants of terror, preparing to move forward. Her mother straightened, brushing her damp hair back, and she saw in her face a quiet resilience, a shared understanding that they had survived, and that they were stronger together than they had been apart. The girl felt that same strength stir within herself, small but resolute, fragile but unwavering. They walked slowly down the porch steps, Rusty padding faithfully beside them, the street glistening beneath their feet. The morning was fresh, heavy with the scent of rain and earth, the world humming with the quiet energy of life continuing. She glanced at her mother, eyes bright despite exhaustion, and realized that the note, the dog, and her small trembling courage had transformed everything. Fear had been present, terror had been real, but so had bravery, love, and resilience. And in that delicate balance, she understood the truth of survival. The darkest moments could be passed through, carried forward with determination, and left behind in fragments that made the dawn feel golden, precious, and sacred. She inhaled deeply, Rusty brushing against her leg, and let the weight of the morning settle into her chest. The storm outside had softened, and the storm within had begun to ease, replaced by the tender, fragile warmth of hope. She squeezed her mother's hand, feeling it squeeze back, a heartbeat in sync, a bridge spanning fear and safety, despair and as the first true rays of sunlight touched their faces, she realized that though the memory of terror would linger, the memory of courage, love, and survival would endure longer, shaping the contours of her life and the life of the mother she had saved.